The Nexus station hung in space like a particularly ambitious jewelry designer's fever dream. All gleaming spires, rotating habitation rings, and enough neon signage to make a Las Vegas casino weep with envy. It served as the diplomatic heart of the Galactic Federation, where species from across known space gathered to engage in the ancient art of calling each other idiots in 17 different languages, while maintaining perfect diplomatic smiles. Today's entertainment came courtesy of Admiral Vex'thul of the Draconic Hegemony, a creature who looked like someone had taken a crocodile, fed it nothing but protein powder and steroids for a decade, then taught it to walk upright and develop an ego problem. His scales gleamed with an iridescent purple that probably cost more to maintain than most planetary defense budgets, and his voice carried the kind of authority that suggested he'd never been told no without immediately having someone executed for the audacity. "Humans," he was saying to his assembled entourage of lesser reptilian officials, the word dripping from his forked tongue like spoiled milk, are perhaps the most amusing addition to our Federation in recent memory. The observation lounge buzzed with the polite sort of laughter that diplomatic functions demanded, not quite genuine amusement, but not dismissive enough to cause an interstellar incident. Various alien dignitaries nursed their exotic beverages and pretended they weren't all thinking the same thing, that Earth's recent admission to the Federation had been more charity case than strategic alliance. Humans, after all, were soft. Everyone knew that. They lacked the chitinous armor of the arthropod collective, the rock-hard hide of the granite communes, or the energy-based physiology of the stellar wisps. They couldn't breathe methane like the Titan clans, survive in hard vacuum like the Void Dancers, or photosynthesize their own nutrients like the Plant Federation. Hell, they couldn't even regenerate lost limbs like the Salamander Republic. What they could do, apparently, was talk, and then talk some more about talking. Their entire military doctrine, Vex'thul continued, warming to his theme like a politician at election time, appears to revolve around the revolutionary concept of "please don't hurt us, we're very sorry for existing." I've reviewed their combat records, such as they are. Their most celebrated victories involve running away very quickly or hiding until the other side gets bored and leaves. This drew more genuine laughter from the crowd. Even the usually diplomatic Crystalline Consortium's ambassador, a being that looked like a sentient chandelier having an identity crisis, made a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, which passed for amusement in their culture. In the corner of the lounge, nursing what appeared to be actual Earth coffee, a beverage that most other species considered roughly equivalent to drinking liquid fire mixed with concentrated anxiety, sat a human diplomat. She was unremarkable by galactic standards, medium height, standard carbon-based biology, no visible natural weapons or defensive adaptation. Her credentials identified her as a junior aide in Earth's diplomatic corps, the kind of background position that typically involved holding clipboards, nodding at appropriate moments, and pretending not to notice when more important people forgot she existed. She listened to Vex'thul's performance with the sort of attention usually reserved for watching paint dry on a particularly humid day. Her expression suggested she found the entire display about as impressive as a child's temper tantrum in a toy store. "Of course," Vex'thul was saying, his voice carrying across the lounge with the subtle volume control of someone who'd never learned the difference between public speaking and public shouting, "I don't entirely blame them for their limitation. Evolution is a harsh mistress, and clearly Earth's environment was simply too comfortable to produce any actual warriors." The human aide took another sip of her coffee, a beverage that could probably strip paint and had been known to send several alien species into mild hallucinations, and continued her silent observation. Around her, the galaxy's finest diplomatic minds nodded along with Vex'thul's assessment, because questioning the military prowess of someone whose species had conquered 12-star systems seemed like the sort of career move typically reserved for people with excellent life insurance policy. "I've been reviewing the upcoming joint military exercises," Vex'thul announced, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to deliver what he considered a particularly clever punchline. "Earth has requested participation. Naturally, I've approved this request. After all, everyone deserves the opportunity to embarrass themselves on a truly galactic scale." The laughter this time was less polite and more anticipatory. Joint military exercises were serious business, combat simulations that tested everything from individual warrior prowess to fleet-level tactical coordination. They were typically dominated by the same handful of militaristic species: the Draconic Hegemony, the warrior clans of Proxima, the battle-forged collective. Species that had earned their place in the Federation through superior firepower and the kind of aggressive negotiation tactics that involved bringing your own army to the peace talks. For humans to volunteer for such an exercise was either remarkably brave or spectacularly stupid. Given their reputation, most observers were leaning toward the latter. "I do hope," Vex'thul continued, his reptilian features arranging themselves into what probably passed for a smile in his species, though it looked more like a crocodile contemplating a particularly fat turret, "that Earth's representatives won't be too disappointed when reality collides with whatever delusions of adequacy they've been nursing. It would be terribly awkward if they started crying. I understand their species leaks salt water from their optical organs when distressed." How wonderfully primitive. The human aide finished her coffee and stood, drawing approximately zero attention from the assembled dignitaries. She moved toward the exit with the unremarkable efficiency of someone whose job description apparently included being professionally invisible. As she passed Vex'thul's group, she paused, just for a moment, and made eye contact with the Admiral. Her expression was perfectly neutral, professionally diplomatic, and contained roughly the same emotional content as a brick wall having philosophical thought. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the ambient conversation, "I look forward to the exercises. Earth appreciates the opportunity to participate." Something in her tone made Vex'thul's smile falter slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to suggest that perhaps his prey wasn't quite as defenseless as advertised. Then the moment passed, she was gone, and he was left with the vague feeling that he'd just been challenged to a duel by someone wielding a particularly polite feather duster. "Charming," he murmured to his aide, a smaller reptilian who looked like Vex'thul's understudy in both size and ambition. "Simply charming. I do so enjoy it when they pretend to have spines." Around the lounge, conversations resumed their normal diplomatic flow, which is to say, everyone went back to saying absolutely nothing of importance while making it sound profound. But underneath the civilized veneer, anticipation began to build like pressure in a badly maintained reactor. The joint military exercises were still 3 days away, but already the galaxy's bookmakers were taking bets. The odds on human success were so long they required scientific notation to express properly. Admiral Vex'thul was going to learn in approximately 72 hours that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that don't look like predators at all. But for now, he basked in the warm glow of his own superiority, blissfully unaware that he'd just challenged someone who considered his entire worldview a delightful intellectual puzzle to be solved through the judicious application of superior planning and what humans charmingly referred to as creative problem-solving. The universe, as it turned out, had quite a sense of humor. The grand banquet hall of Nexus Station resembled what might happen if a Renaissance palace and a space-age nightclub had a baby, then immediately enrolled it in architectural therapy. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that displayed real-time views of nearby nebulae, while tables crafted from rare metamorphic asteroids hosted the galaxy's most insufferable dinner guests. Tonight's menu featured delicacies from across known space, fermented plasma fruits from the Electron Gardens, pressure-cooked methane kelp from Titan's oceans, and something that looked suspiciously like regular Earth chicken but cost roughly the same as a small moon. The diplomatic corps had gathered for what was ostensibly a cultural exchange dinner, though everyone knew it was really an excuse for various species to engage in competitive ego-stroking, while pretending to enjoy each other's cuisine. Admiral Vex'thul held court at the head table like a scaly monarch surveying his domain. His dinner companions, a mix of military attaches, trade representatives, and assorted hangers-on, listened to his every word with the sort of rapt attention typically reserved for religious experiences or impending natural disaster. "The fascinating thing about humans," he was saying while gesticulating with a fork that could have doubled as a medieval weapon, "is their complete inability to recognize their own limitations. It's almost endearing in the same way that watching a small child attempt to lift a starship engine is endearing." At a smaller table near the back, Earth's diplomatic delegation sat in what could charitably be called companionable silence. The ambassador, a distinguished gentleman whose main qualification seemed to be his ability to look statesmanlike while saying absolutely nothing controversial, nodded along with conversations he clearly wasn't following. His security chief, a woman who looked like she could arm wrestle a battle tank and win, maintained the sort of situational awareness that came from years of expecting the worst from every social gathering. And there was the aide again, still unremarkable, still nursing beverages that would send most species to the emergency medical bay. She listened to Vex'thul's ongoing monologue with the patient attention of someone watching a particularly predictable nature document. Take their military history, Vex'thul continued, warming to his favorite theme. Thousands of years of warfare, and their greatest innovations involve finding increasingly creative ways to run away from problems. Strategic withdrawal, they call it. Tactical repositioning, regrouping for future engagement. Such delightfully euphemistic ways to say we got scared and ran like frightened youngling. The laughter that followed was louder this time, emboldened by expensive alien alcohol and the sort of group dynamics that turned reasonable beings into giggling sycophants. Even species that typically maintain strict diplomatic neutrality found themselves chuckling along. The human aide set down her cup, some kind of tea this time, though it steamed in a way that suggested it was still hot enough to weld metal and steel. The movement was so casual, so utterly unremarkable, that it took several seconds for the nearby conversations to register that she was walking toward the head table. Admiral Vex'thul, she said, her voice carrying just enough to cut through the ambient chatter without seeming rage. I couldn't help but overhear your analysis of human military doctrine. The hall didn't exactly fall silent. Diplomatic functions were too well orchestrated for such dramatic pauses, but there was definitely a noticeable decrease in ambient noise. Conversations continued, but at lower volumes, as various beings suddenly found themselves very interested in what the small human had to say to the large armed reptile. Vex'thul turned toward her with the sort of slow, predatory movement that suggested he was already calculating exactly how much amusement he could extract from this interaction. His smile revealed teeth that could probably chew through starship hull plate. The little aide speaks, he said, his voice carrying just enough condescension to be insulting without being diplomatically actionable. Please do enlighten us with Earth's perspective on military matters. I'm sure we could all use some comic relief between courses. The aide moved closer, stopping at what most species would consider a respectful distance, but which for humans was just close enough to be subtly threatening. Her expression remained perfectly neutral, professionally diplomatic, and contained roughly the same emotional warmth as a black hole's event horizon. Your assessment is interesting, she said, the word interesting carrying the sort of subtle inflection that suggested she found it roughly as interesting as watching paint dry in a vacuum. Though I notice it's based primarily on historical records rather than practical experience. Something in her tone made several of the dinner guests exchange glances. The crystalline consortium's representative made a sound like wind chimes in a minor key, their species equivalent of nervous laughter. Practical experience? Vex'thul repeated, his voice taking on the dangerous purr of a predator that had just spotted movement in the underbrush. Are you suggesting, little human, that your kind has practical military experience worth discussing? I'm suggesting, she replied, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone one might use to discuss weather patterns or dinner plans, that theoretical knowledge has certain limitations. The upcoming joint exercises should provide an excellent opportunity to test various hypotheses. The hall was definitely quieter now. Even the ambient music seemed to have decreased in volume, as if the station's AI was consciously eavesdropping on the conversation. Vex'thul leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his considerable bulk. His eyes, predatory slits that had probably been the last thing many beings had seen, fixed on the human with the sort of attention a hawk might give a particularly interesting mouse. Are you, he said slowly, savoring each word like fine wine, challenging the draconic hegemony to personal combat during the exercises? The aide tilted her head slightly as if considering the question from multiple angles. I'm observing that your species places considerable emphasis on individual warrior prowess. Perhaps a demonstration would be educational for all parties involved. Around the hall, beings who had been conducting perfectly reasonable conversations about trade agreements and cultural exchange programs suddenly found themselves placing discreet wagers through their personal communication devices. The odds on human success were so astronomical that several bookmaking operations crashed trying to calculate them. Vex'thul's smile widened to reveal even more teeth. Personal combat then, one-on-one during the exercise, standard Federation rules, non-lethal weapons, victory conditions clearly defined, medical support standing by. He paused dramatically,
Of course, if you're having second thoughts about challenging a warrior who has never known defeat in personal combat. Admiral, she said, her voice carrying the sort of patient tone usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to particularly slow children. I accept your terms. Standard Federation rules, non-lethal engagement, full medical support. I look forward to the educational opportunity. The silence that followed was the sort of absolute quiet that typically precedes either standing ovations or natural disasters. Various alien dignitaries stared at the small human who had just challenged what was arguably the most dangerous individual warrior in the known galaxy to single combat. Vex'thul's aide, the smaller reptilian, who spent most of his time agreeing with whatever his superior said, leaned over and whispered something that sounded like urgent caution mixed with barely controlled panic. Excellent, Vex'thul said, ignoring his subordinate's concerns with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through superior firepower. 3 days hence, during the exercises. I do hope your medical insurance is comprehensive. The human aide inclined her head in what might have been respect or might have been a subtle mockery of diplomatic protocol. Thank you for the opportunity, Admiral. I'm sure it will be illuminating. She turned and walked back toward her table with the same unremarkable efficiency she'd displayed throughout the evening. Behind her, the hall erupted into the sort of excited chatter typically associated with sporting events or pending apocalypse. Admiral Vex'thul returned to his meal with the satisfied air of someone who had just arranged an afternoon's entertainment. Around him, his entourage congratulated him on his upcoming victory with the sort of enthusiastic certainty that suggested they'd never actually met a human in combat. None of them noticed that the human aide, upon returning to her seat, pulled out a small communication device and sent a brief message that simply read, "Exercise parameters confirmed. Initiate Protocol 7. The universe's sense of humor, it seemed, was about to get considerably more pronounced.
The Federation's joint military exercise arena looked like someone had taken a small moon, hollowed it out, and then decorated the interior with the collective nightmares of 1,000 weapons designers. Obstacle courses that defied several laws of physics wound around combat platforms suspended over what appeared to be actual lava, though the safety briefing insisted it was merely thermally enhanced synthetic magma substitute. The observation decks were packed with diplomatic personnel, military attaches, and what could only be described as the galaxy's most bloodthirsty sports fans. Admiral Vex'thul stood at the center of the primary combat platform like a scaled monument to his own magnificence. His ceremonial armor, which managed to be both decorative and functionally terrifying, gleamed under the arena's lighting systems. Various weapons harnesses displayed an impressive array of non-lethal but undoubtedly painful combat implements. He moved through his warm-up routine with the fluid precision of someone who had never lost a fight and couldn't conceive of starting now. The crowd loved him, naturally. Cheers erupted from the draconic sections every time he demonstrated a particularly impressive combat stance, while representatives from the warrior clans of Proxima offered appreciative roars that could probably be heard in neighboring star systems. On the opposite platform, the human aide performed her own preparation routine, which consisted primarily of stretching. Simple, unremarkable stretching exercises that looked like something one might do before a pleasant jog through the park. She wore standard Federation exercise gear, form-fitting but unremarkable, designed for mobility rather than intimidation. No ceremonial armor, no impressive weapon displays, no theatrical posturing for the crowd. The betting pools had reached the point where several minor civilizations were using the odds as alternative currency systems. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities, announced the arena's commentator, a crystalline being whose voice resonated through both auditory and telepathic channels. Today's exhibition match features Admiral Vex'thul, undefeated champion of 17 worlds. Again there was a pause as the commentator apparently consulted notes. A human diplomatic aide whose name we're not actually sure how to pronounce. This drew laughter from the crowd, though it died down quickly as various beings focused their attention on the small figure who had somehow managed to get herself into a combat arena with the galaxy's most notorious warrior. The human finished her stretching routine and approached the weapons selection area. Standard Federation rules allowed each combatant to choose from an array of non-lethal but effective implements: energy batons, neural disruptors, gravitic nets, and various other devices designed to incapacitate without permanent damage. Vex'thul had selected what appeared to be enough weaponry to outfit a small military unit: energy weapons, impact devices, defensive screens, and something that looked suspiciously like a portable artillery piece, though the safety officials insisted it was merely an enhanced kinetic displacement device. The human aide examined the weapons array with the sort of careful attention typically reserved for selecting produce at a market. She picked up a simple energy baton, the most basic weapon available, tested its balance, and nodded approvingly. Then she walked away from the weapons station. "Excuse me," called the arena official, a purple-skinned humanoid whose job involved ensuring proper equipment distribution. "You're entitled to select additional weapons." "This will be sufficient," she replied, giving the energy baton a few experimental swings that suggested she actually knew how to use it properly. In the observation deck, the human ambassador leaned over to his security chief. "Should we be concerned that our diplomatic aide just brought the equivalent of a pocket knife to a gunfight?" "Sir," the security chief replied, her expression suggesting she knew something that wasn't being shared with the general population. "I wouldn't worry about it." The combat began with Vex'thul doing what Vex'thul did best, advancing like a natural disaster with delusions of grandeur. His opening move involved 3 different ranged weapons: a gravitic displacement field, and what appeared to be a small localized weather system. The attack was powerful, coordinated, and would have been devastatingly effective against any opponent who was actually standing where he'd been aiming. The human aide wasn't there anymore. She had moved, not dramatically, not with the sort of acrobatic flourishes that impressed crowds, but with the efficient economy of motion that suggested she knew exactly where she needed to be, and exactly when she needed to be there. Vex'thul's devastating opening salvo struck empty air while she materialized at his flank, energy baton humming softly. The first strike was almost casual, a tap against his armor that shouldn't have penetrated his defenses, but somehow sent feedback through his entire weapons array. Warning lights began flashing across his equipment harnesses as various systems reported mysterious malfunctions. "Technical difficulties," announced the commentator, though there was a note of confusion in their crystalline voice. "Admiral Vex'thul appears to be experiencing equipment issues." Vex'thul snarled and activated his backup systems, spinning toward where the human should have been. She wasn't there either. She was behind him, delivering another almost gentle tap that caused his defensive screens to flicker and fade. The crowd began to murmur with the sort of nervous energy that suggested they were witnessing something unprecedented and weren't entirely sure how to react to it. What followed wasn't so much a fight as it was a physics lesson delivered by someone who had apparently memorized the technical specifications of every piece of Federation combat equipment ever manufactured. Each time Vex'thul launched an attack, the human wasn't where the attack was aimed. Each time he tried to track her movement, she was already completing an action that rendered another piece of his elaborate weapon array inoperative. It was surgical, clinical, and absolutely devastatingly effective. "This is impossible," growled Vex'thul, his voice carrying across the arena as another weapon system sparked and died under the human's impossibly precise interventions. "You're cheating somehow." "Admiral," she replied, her voice perfectly calm despite the fact that she was simultaneously dodging gravitic pulses and disabling military-grade equipment with what appeared to be a recreational sports implement. "I'm simply applying basic mechanical principles. Perhaps you're unfamiliar with the concept." The insult was delivered with such clinical politeness that it took several seconds for its full impact to register. When it did, Vex'thul's roar of fury could probably be heard on the station's outer hull. His final assault was everything he had left. Every remaining weapon, every backup system, every reserve of strength and fury focused into one overwhelming attack that would have leveled a small building. The human aide stepped sideways, let the attack pass harmlessly by, and delivered a single precise strike to the back of Vex'thul's neck. The Admiral, undefeated champion of 17 worlds, terror of the Outer Rim, and the galaxy's most arrogant dinner guest, collapsed face first onto the arena floor with a thud that echoed through the suddenly silent stadium. The medical team rushed onto the platform as the human aide deactivated her energy baton and walked toward the edge of the combat area. She paused only once to look up at the observation deck where the diplomatic corps sat in stunned silence. Her expression suggested that she found the entire affair about as challenging as her morning stretching routine. Combat concluded, announced the commentator, their voice carrying the sort of bewildered uncertainty typically associated with witnessing natural laws being politely violated. Victory to the human diplomatic aide, whose name we still can't pronounce. In the observation deck, the human ambassador turned to his security chief with an expression that demanded immediate explanations. "Sir," she said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss her actual job description." The medical bay of Nexus Station hummed with the sort of efficient activity that suggested the galaxy's finest healers were working overtime to repair someone's catastrophically damaged ego. Admiral Vex'thul lay on a bioregeneration bed, his reptilian features arranged in what could charitably be described as a sulk of truly cosmic proportion. Various alien medical devices beeped and whirred around him, though the most serious injury appeared to be to his pride, which unfortunately for him, wasn't covered under standard galactic health insurance. 17 different weapons systems, he was saying to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the sort of wounded bewilderment typically associated with natural disaster survivors, custom modified by the finest military engineers in known space. How does someone disable 17 weapons systems with a recreational sports implement? The hegemony's chief medical officer, a being that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a very irritated librarian, made soothing noises while running diagnostic scans. "Admiral," the human struck each device at precisely the optimal point to cause cascade system failures. The technical precision required would be extraordinary. "Extraordinary," Vex'thul's voice cracked slightly. "She treated my combat gear like a child's puzzle box. Every strike was exactly where it needed to be to cause maximum system disruption with minimum effort. It was like she had the technical specifications memorized." In the adjacent medical bay's waiting area, the Galactic Diplomatic Corps had gathered for what was ostensibly a post-exercise debriefing, but was really an excuse for everyone to demand explanations from the human delegation. Various species clustered in small groups, their conversations buzzing with the sort of excited confusion that suggested the natural order of the universe had just been politely but firmly rearranged. The human ambassador, whose diplomatic smile had developed a slightly strained quality, found himself surrounded by increasingly pointed questions from beings who had recently lost significant amounts of money on what they'd assumed was a sure bet. "Ambassador," said the Crystalline Consortium's representative, their voice chiming with barely contained curiosity, "perhaps you could clarify your aide's background." "Certainly," the ambassador replied, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver information that was both completely truthful and utterly inadequate. "She's a member of our diplomatic support staff. Excellent with paperwork, very reliable, makes outstanding coffee." The Void Dancer's delegate, a being of pure energy, who looked like a sentient aurora, having philosophical thoughts, flickered with what might have been amusement. "Ambassador, beings who make excellent coffee don't typically dismantle military equipment with surgical precision." Before the ambassador could formulate another diplomatically evasive response, the subject of their discussion entered the waiting area. She moved with the same unremarkable efficiency she'd displayed throughout the week, carrying what appeared to be actual paperwork, and looking like someone whose primary concern was whether the medical bay's coffee machine was functioning properly. "Ah," she said, noticing the assembled crowd, "I hope Admiral Vex'thul is recovering well. I made sure to target nerve clusters that would cause temporary incapacitation rather than permanent damage." The casual way she discussed what amounted to combat surgery caused several beings to exchange meaningful glances. The Plant Federation's representative, a walking tree with delusions of sophistication, rustled with nervous energy. "Miss," began the Draconic Hegemony's trade attaché, a smaller reptilian who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy, "perhaps you could explain how a diplomatic aide acquired such specialized knowledge." She tilted her head slightly, as if the question required careful consideration. "Well, before I joined the Diplomatic Corps, I had a different career path. Military service, primarily in what we call asymmetric warfare research. The technical term would be special operations, though we prefer to think of it as creative problem-solving under adverse conditions." The silence that followed was the sort of absolute quiet typically associated with the moments before major revelations or stellar collapses. "Special operations," repeated the ambassador,
his voice carrying the tone of someone who was learning important information about his own staff for the first time. 15 years with Earth's most classified military units, she continued conversationally, as if discussing her favorite recipe. Specialization in equipment, neutralization, tactical analysis, and what the manuals euphemistically call personnel management in hostile environments. After retirement, I decided to pursue something more peaceful. Diplomacy seemed like a nice change of pace. The warrior clan's representative, a being that looked like someone had crossed a bear with a tank and then taught it proper table manners, made a sound that might have been respect or might have been existential terror. "You're telling us," said the Crystalline Consortium's delegate, their voice taking on the careful tone of someone trying to process information that defied their understanding of reality, that Earth routinely assigns retired special operations personnel to diplomatic support positions. "Oh goodness no," she laughed, the sound carrying just enough genuine amusement to be truly terrifying. "Most of my colleagues went into private security or consulting work. I was the only one who thought shuffling paperwork and making coffee sounded relaxing." From the medical bay, Admiral Vex'thul's voice could be heard demanding to know exactly what Protocol 7 meant, and why nobody had bothered to mention that Earth's diplomatic corps, apparently recruited from their equivalent of mythical warrior society. "Protocol 7, she explained to the assembled crowd, is simply our contingency plan for situations where formal diplomatic channels prove insufficient. Sometimes the most effective way to resolve cultural misunderstandings is through practical demonstration." The ambassador finally found his voice. "When you say practical demonstration, I mean showing rather than telling, sir." Admiral Vex'thul believed humans were soft because he'd never actually encountered one in a context where softness would be counterproductive. Now he has more complete information upon which to base future assessments. The beautiful simplicity of it struck the assembled diplomats like a revelation delivered by particularly violent physics. The human hadn't just won a fight, she'd conducted a comprehensive educational program disguised as personal combat. "So," said the Void Dancer's delegate, their energy form flickering with what was definitely amusement now, "when the Admiral called your species soft, you decided to correct his misconception through direct experience." "Diplomatic correction through kinesthetic learning," she agreed cheerfully. "Very effective for certain personality type." From the medical bay came the sound of Admiral Vex'thul demanding a rematch, followed immediately by his medical officer explaining that challenging someone to repeated combat after they'd already demonstrated superior tactical capabilities was typically considered a symptom of head trauma. The human aide glanced toward the medical bay with the sort of patient expression usually reserved for watching small children learn important life lessons through natural consequences. "I do hope this experience proves educational for everyone involved," she said, gathering her paperwork with the same methodical precision she'd applied to dismantling military equipment. "Cultural exchange is so much more effective when all parties have accurate information to work with." As she walked away, the assembled galactic elite stood in stunned silence, processing the revelation that Earth's diplomatic corps apparently contained individuals who treated interstellar incidents like teaching moments, and considered single combat against legendary warriors to be a reasonable conflict resolution strategy. The universe's sense of humor, it turned out, had a particularly refined appreciation for irony. Admiral Vex'thul had called humans soft, and in response, one had demonstrated exactly how much damage softness could do when it came wrapped in tactical precision and delivered with diplomatic politeness. Somewhere in the medical bay, a legendary warrior was learning that pride, when properly prepared, did indeed taste exactly like candy, bitter, humbling, and impossible to forget.